introduce the speaker today. Paul Solomon had an expression that many of us heard years ago and loved, and he even had it written all over a t-shirt. I don't remember every word on it, but some of you will remember he said something to the effect of talking about all of us. You are intricate, delicate, complex, amazing, astonishing, and so forth and so on. Well, David Solomon certainly is that. He lives a rich life and a rich journey. It was my deep pleasure to meet him back in the 70s when we were all a little bit younger. In fact, he was about your son's age, 19, and I remember seeing him, this skinny blonde-headed boy full of energy who came running in, and I don't remember the exact day I saw you or when that was, but it was at that time period, and I remember thinking, what a bright light. What a lovely energy. That really struck me, and others I knew said the same thing. And I thought how fortunate we are to meet him and to have him come in to be part of this family. That continues to be true. Good things only grow with age, like a fine wine. And now as our children are getting older, we're getting younger. And David hasn't gotten to speak with us for a while, but I find he always speaks with wisdom, and his brain is an amazing good tool that he uses, and he speaks from the heart, the soul. He brings it together in a balance. That's what I feel coming from David, the balance. And I so look forward to hearing his message today, as I'm sure we all do. So with no further ado, let's give him a warm welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Beautiful Sunday. I hope I get through this without going too much over, so I'll do my best. I don't mean to be presumptuous wearing this Japanese priest robe. I wear it more as an example to the story. So I brought my friend, my bonsai, that I brought from part of my gardens in Washington State, and I brought 3 with me, and I brought one this morning to kind of illustrate a story that we're talking about. You know, my series on the Dead Saints Chronicles continues, and this week's was titled "The Training Wires of the Soul," and it's actually the same section as the first part of the book. So I actually have Paul's robe underneath this, so we have a kind of mixture of Eastern and Western traditions here. But I want to tell you first a little bit about the story of how I came into possession of this robe. It actually used to be Paul Solomon's robe, and it's an interesting story because when Paul and I went to Japan in 1987, we went to Tamasan's temple in Kamakura. And one of the first people we met within the first few weeks there was a man named Watanabe Sensei, who was 83 years old, and he was wearing this robe. And when Paul met him, he said, "What a beautiful robe." And of course, he was not aware of the Japanese custom that when you like something, they've got to give it to you. So literally right there in the temple, Mr. Watanabe took off his robe, literally stripped down to his undies, and gave Paul the robe. And Paul took off his clothes and gave him to Mr. Watanabe, and they switched attire. You know, when you don't get a sense of the reverence and humbleness of the Japanese until you see such a thing happen. You know, you're surrounded by this beautiful temple with bamboo tatami mats underneath your feet. That's been there for 100 years. And of course, we went there to see Tamo-san, the Buddhist priestess, who was 75 at the time. And we were doing readings in the temple, actually. And I was the conductor for the readings at the time. And Mr. Watanabe had wanted a reading, and because he had searched for God his entire life. He visited every religion, of course had been a Buddhist priest, And it was perhaps one of the greatest readings I've ever heard from Paul when we gave it. And that will become a part of this talk this morning. So, a part of this talk this morning is investigating the East, mixing it in with Christianity from the West. And where do the two meet? Before I begin with my tree, let me first talk about a continuing thought and idea that I've seen. Because most of us strive to know God and know the light, or we strive to know Jesus. But how do we really get there? You know, if someone were to ask me, David, in your 35 years, how could you boil this down to a few things? So, one of the brilliant statements that I saw in the Dead Saints, the Dead Saints Chronicles that I'm writing, the Dead Saints are people, those who have died, had near-death experience, and were resurrected from the dead, and I call them Dead Saints. One of the brilliant statements they wrote is, death is a lie, humans tell themselves. Interesting statement. Death is a lie, humans tell themselves. How could that be? There is only one thing in the universe that a human being cannot do, and you cannot imagine not being. You just can't. If you try to imagine yourself as dead, you will picture a body in a casket, a funeral, lots of flowers, solemn words, and mourners dressed in black. But you are still there. You are simply observing from another vantage point. Everything that involves fear to any extent is a march towards death. Most of the top 10 sellers in the bookstore are about murder, death, and dying. We are entertained by war and movies that imitate or reenact death. Heck, The Walking Dead is still the #1 series after 3 years. What does that tell you? We are thrilled at being scared to death, entertaining ourselves through dangerous death-defying feats, creating faster and faster ways to propel ourselves from one place to another. We attempt to corral death with costly coffins and impenetrable metals. And finally, to insult death, we toy with cryogenics and cloning. Still, the most popular and widely used method for exploring death is the choice not to be alive in the present. How many of us, if you sit at a restaurant and poll the people there, how many of 100 have their cell phone in front of them and are texting and not aware or not being present? I had a particularly bad habit of that. As my mom used to point out to me, I'd be thinking about the past, I'd be talking to someone, and I'll be thinking about something else. Even in Paul's classes, we'd be having a class on something, and I'd be thinking about something else and not being there. It is a way to die and not be alive. That's an important concept to understand. Of course, your fantasies allow you to escape in the living, the now. You are as good as dead to the present. You are not really dead, but kind of only pretend dead. But there's little difference. Both allow this experience to be next week or the week before, and the moment is lost. You will not remember what the other person has said when you talk to them. You won't remember their name. You'll have to check someone else's notes or ask them their name again. Please tell me your full name so that I can remember. And hopefully I'll remember. All this because you're living in another time and another place and not now. You've killed the present. The less conscious you are of life, the more dead you are. Jesus said, let the dead bury the dead. Let those who are alive to life follow me, he said. Total lack of consciousness is a step deeper into your fantasy of annihilation and non-existence. But it is not real either. You can deprive yourself of your physical body, but it is not real. It does not equate to death. Everything in this life is dying from the minute it's born. It's one thing to say it, to repeat it, and to know it intellectually. It's quite another to actually sit there and see it, really see it. It's a very strange experience. All the things we all put so much importance to, wealth, having a partner, a big house, a career, a job, possessions in 100 years' time will be gone or belong to somebody else. We take years building up wealth and security, and then without any warning, we die for whatever reason. As the saying goes, we can't take it with us. Everything we do in this life stays here and means absolutely nothing in the next one. The reason we do this and why we do this is on the belief that life is temporary. It is a faith in material life and is not a faith in eternal life. So why shouldn't we fear death? It seems so real, right? I mean, a lot of us, even though we believe in God or believe in Christ, it still requires faith that something is there beyond this life. So is it our faith that keeps our fears at bay? Why is death a lie? Why is it a non-event? Perhaps it will help understand these questions by understanding what death is not. To understand what death is not, the concept of Zen, that's why I bring my little tree here this morning, gives some guidance. To define Zen, it's difficult. In the olden times, Zen masters responded to such questions with, Zen is Zen. Much like the burning bush answered Moses when he said, what's your name? I am that I am. While terse and to the point, this definition hardly offers any help to modern seekers of what Zen is. Simple sayings include, every day is a good day. When one scoops up water, the moon is reflected back. When one handles flowers, the scent soaks into the robe. These ideas can drive your mind crazy. But essentially, Zen attempts to describe what is versus what is not. So if we apply the concept of Zen to what death is not, we run right smack into the Zen-like wisdom and experience of saints, prophets, and apostles written in holy books. Wise men and women have attempted to communicate the concept of death and its opposites by using different synonyms and antonyms, but are still limited by verbal or written words of their experiences. The limitation of words to describe an experience is recorded by an ancient Chinese story of a stonecutter who trained his son to sharpen swords. If the pressure was too light, the sword wouldn't sharpen properly. If the pressure was too deep, the sword would not sharpen properly and be too erratic. The father's teaching of the right amount of pressure to sharpen the blade was discovered by doing and experiencing, not by wisdom gained from his words or from books. The legend states the wise words written in books are like dead bones. It is only a reflection of the truth. The real learning comes from experience. So in essence, to understand what death is not, do we have to have a near-death experience to understand the right pressure to sharpen the sword? Or are we left only with words, symbols that are dead bones that only touch the periphery of the sacred? It seems that only a select few prophets, apostles, and dead saints, those resurrected from death to life, have broken out of the bonds of flesh to experience the transforming light of God. So how do we cross this bridge to join this great cloud of witnesses, those beings of light that have passed on before us? First, you must know that truth is not a word, but it's a living being. symbolized by words. A being known by the living and resurrected saints as life itself. It is a living experience. So here comes the Zen. Do we have to experience, how do we experience living truth? Do we have to die to experience the light or the living truth? To be transformed by it? So here's where I'd like to take a moment to bring in the East. Because on one side, we have the concept of nature. And on the other side, we have the concept in Christianity of Jesus Christ. How do we find a path that makes this experience real, living in us? So that it's not temporary, so that it's not a splash of light. And then we go back to being human again. So, I hope I don't run out of time.
You're fine.
So back in 1982, I was at Hearthfire Lodge. And if you don't know Hearthfire Lodge, it was this Jeffersonian, looked like the White House. 4 pillars in front. It was 7 bedrooms, and large rooms, and it was where our little school was up in the Shenandoah Valley. We had 7 of us there. And I was up on the 2nd floor, and I looked down the driveway, and if you knew the driveway at Hearthfire, it was lined with about 15 or 20 100-foot spruce trees. And I saw this gravel dust come down the road, and it was an Oldsmobile. And I thought, well, who's that? We're not expecting anybody today. So, in front of Hearthfire, there was a circle where you could go around and park. And the car parks in front of the steps, and this guy gets out. And I didn't recognize him. It was like a 6-foot American. And I thought, who's that? And so I went downstairs, and on my way downstairs, Paul Solomon had come out to greet this gentleman. And, of course, within minutes, I found out it was Felton Jones, his bonsai teacher. Now, I'd heard the stories, of course. Paul has a great talk on the planetary mystery schools. And most of us know that, and I can't get into that full talk today. There's not time. But what I can do is get into the essence of the story because, after hugging and meeting each other, Paul and Felton, basically took off in his yellow Pacer down the road. And, back in those days, we didn't have cell phones. And I said, Paul, what are you doing? Where are you going? And he just took off for hours with Felton. I said, dang, are we going to have a class? What's happening? We're going to have a talk? So they came back about 2 or 3 hours later. They obviously had gone to a local nursery in Harrisonburg, about 25 minutes away, and had picked out 7 little nursery trees for us to bonsai. Now, Paul describes the story of going to a school in 1974 down in Atlanta, Georgia, and first learning about bonsai and hearing about the Zen master and how great he was. And of course, Felton always denied everything and never talked about being spiritual. But I had a chance firsthand to experience this man. Now, you wouldn't, you get this idea of swamis and spiritual guys and how they're supposed to be, but he was not any of that. He was a chain-smoking American. And, of course, Paul was a pipe-smoking Meerschaum pipe guy with the vanilla tobacco. So I guess they complemented one another. So they came back with the trees, and the tree, they set the trees before us, and Felton said, choose your tree. So each of us got to choose a tree, and my tree, I chose this 2-foot-high azalea, red azalea, with the small little leaves, and I thought, that's my tree. Now, I had never done bonsai before. This was new to me. I was a bonsai virgin. So we decided to do our trees, and I didn't do anything. I was told not to do anything, and Felton actually went through with each student. Sharon Solomon was there. Andrew Schaefer, Thomas Keller and his wife Marianne were there. Murr was there. And Stephen was out that time. He was not there at the time. He was out on a trip. So anyway, by the time they got to my tree, Felton looked at it, looked at me, took his shears, just these concave shears that are like this, and if you can imagine the tree, he basically chopped off the largest branch in front and said, "We're done." You know, basically the tree had looked like an azalea bush, and he chopped off one large branch and the whole tree, of course the trunk was opened up, but I was shocked. What the heck? And he said, "We're done. Just trim off the dead branches and..." Okay. So Paul came over to me after Felton went back to what he was doing, and he said, "Well, Paul, I don't know what he did." He said, "This tree is supposed to represent me," because he started talking about how the tree represents us. He said, "Well, David, you know, he cut off your entire personality that you show people. And you're going to have to grow back these branches, and it's going to take you years to grow them back, to fill that in a little bit. Just as this tree fills in those little branches, it's the part that you make more beautiful." Well, that was the gist of the session that evening. We actually went in. I actually have a tape of that session that's never been sold. We actually have that. A cassette tape. Who can find cassette tape players anymore?
My car.
Yeah. So, you know, I thought maybe I had learned something about bonsai, and literally within the next month, I was out trying to collect bonsai from the wild, because that was the best, coolest trees. And I went up to Mount Jackson, about 10 miles away, north of Hearthfire, and I was climbing up around the mountains, and I found this cool-looking pine, and I thought, I'm going to take this tree and I'm going to show Felton just I've learned from him and what I'm doing. So I'm sitting, so I ripped that tree out of the ground. I mean, basically, you know, when you find a tree in the wilderness, the roots go into the cracks, and typically, if you cut those roots, and I didn't know this at the time, if you cut those major roots, you're going to kill that tree, but you won't know it for 3 weeks. So 3 weeks later, I write, see, I've been keeping a journal. 3 weeks later, I write on May 2nd, which is basically a month and a half after he visited. He said, I wrote, "My bonsai tree is dying. If that tree dies, I feel that I will have committed a great crime. I was impatient to show off that tree to everyone. My impatience has killed that tree and the tree that I tried to grow. Impatience and lack of discipline have desecrated this specimen. God forgive me. I remembered your voice as I climbed Mount Jackson that day, the guilt and uneasiness of the venture to uproot that bonsai specimen. I will never do that again. I will not attempt to selfishly manipulate trees until I've learned to love them and I've learned to treat them with the patience and care that benefits these hardy angels of your kingdom." I used to be hard on myself. I'm learning a little better. So that was kind of again, it was an example of trying to impress and show rather than understand the life within a tree. Part of it's just not knowing how to collect trees from the wild, but it's demonstrated itself in years after that. It's about learning what life is and what death is not. You know, in 1987, I traveled with Paul, to Tama-san's temple where he met Mr. Watanabe. You know, Tama-san was an example of the first enlightened priestess in Japan in 500 years. She claimed to have been enlightened at the age of 22. She was waiting for ordination in a Buddhist faith, and she saw on the wall this rice paper that had been painted in kanji, in Japanese kanji, "Seeing the Truth." And when she saw that rice paper written kanji, the scroll broke into millions of golden particles and streamed into her body. And she was literally enlightened on that spot. And as she says, she remained that way until her death. She exhibited the examples of what an enlightened person or illumined person is. She carried herself like a child to the temple. She was happy all the time. She didn't have that frowning adult concerned look about her. I couldn't understand a word she said half the time. Of course, more 75% of the time, because even though I was learning Japanese, I didn't understand her because she spoke like it was Greek. She spent her time eating weeds from her garden, breathing in the sunlight, and enjoying the air and good water. One experience in particular was very transforming to me, exemplary, being an example of the light. Paul sent a brass crucifix, actually just like this one, but with Jesus hanging from it. I don't know if any of you remember that, but he actually gave it to her and had me bring it to Japan on one of my trips back to the temple. When Thomason saw the cross and the crucifix, I thought she was just, wow, this Eastern Christian thing would work. She literally screamed and ran out of the room. Scared me to death. Amiko, my Japanese wife at the time, didn't know what was going on either. I mean, it took Thomason an hour to come back. And she came back, she was settled down, and she had Emmy and I unscrew Jesus from the cross and took him off the cross and laid him down at the base of it, and took the cross and put it next to her most sacred place on her altar in the center of her sanctuary, and raised up Jesus next to Buddha as a living Jesus, because that's all she knew, was the living, the being of light, of truth that she knew. You know, another man exemplified this, because it's a great conflict in religion. And that is St. Francis of Assisi. Did any of you ever watch Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, the story perfectly illustrates that this man went through a transforming experience in the wilderness. He was not a man who was trained in Christian literature. He was a spoiled brat who went to war and came, to fight for Assisi, and came back because he had found a leper on the road on the way there, and it kind of shocked him, but it's not what transformed him. What the stories don't tell you is he spent 6 years in the wilderness. We only see him in the movie coming back into town as this crazy man who took off his clothes, exposed himself naked, but completely unafraid and transformed. It's said that St. Francis was able to talk to birds, call them, lectured to them. You should be praising God. He actually convinced a wolf who was killing people in town to stop, talk to him. He talked to the fire. He was sitting next to the fire and it was burning up his clothes, his robe. And his students were around him trying to put out the fire, and he said, "Don't do that. I'll gently roll in the snow." He wouldn't step on rocks because he thought that these were the rocks of Christ. He would not step in water where other people would be stepping in water so as not to desecrate the water. He had such a reverence for nature that he learned Scripture, and Christ, and sat upon that rock of creation. And that's been a very difficult thing for the Catholic Church to get. They actually wrote that St. Francis made creation worthy again after taking the corruption that the pagans had put into it. So, but that's how they explain it away to one of the most saintly priests and saints we've ever known, who actually lived the life of Christ. The reading that Paul gave to Mr. Watanabe Sensei can be summarized this way. The best that a man can do is to walk in utter peace among nature with absolute confidence in your heart that the power of nature is the manifestation of life. It is not a principle, it is not a religion, but it is a living friend. While we can use words to communicate with this living friend, it is a knowing in your heart. It is a peace and stillness in you that knows God and reveals God in you. Any moment your mind is troubled or there is worry, then you might know that it is not the voice of God speaking. It is not the voice of truth speaking to you, because worry is not the truth. Fear is not the truth. Truth speaks his name with confidence. Darkness cannot overcome light. Fear and death cannot overcome life and love. Living truth is knowing a friend. And that is in every area of your life. Whether you are a nurse, or a physicist, or a bonsai master, or that you love Jesus Christ. If you really want to know and become a master of your life, you have to make that vocation or that being a living friend. Someone you talk to daily. Someone you get to know daily. There's an experience I had when I was a teenager. And I say this because I was certainly a believer in Christ as a kid, as a teenager. But my friends in high school and I were hunting birds for sport with BB guns in 25 acres of woods next to our house. The local forest in Virginia Beach was always a place of refuge for us and where we spent most of our time during the summer. It was late afternoon and I hadn't bagged a bird yet. Most of the time we shot at blackbirds, but with their low pressure air pump action and poor aim, we almost always missed our intended target. Hunting always seemed to fill that savage part of us somehow as kids. I don't know why. But as I approached a row of bushes lined in a ditch, I noticed a sparrow perched on a branch just 10 feet away from me. Without thinking, I took aim, held my breath, and pulled the trigger. It was a perfect shot. How can you miss from 10 feet away? The sparrow instantly fell dead to the ground and rolled down to the bottom of the ditch, end over end like an old tire. As if in slow motion, the poor creature finally came to rest at the center of a large maple leaf, its lifeless eyes staring up at me, accusingly saying, "Why did you kill me?" Blood spilled out of the sparrow's wound in a horrible pool next to its head. Slowly, the slight weight of the creature caused the fingered edges of the old leaf to gently curl up like the hand of God. The gleaming pool of blood shocked me. For most of my teenage years, like I said, I'd always believed in Jesus Christ, but he was the man in heaven, not the light of God in that creature. Or in the trees, or in creation. The wrongness of the act marked a rude awakening that affected me very much, and I never shot another creature again. So again, we have the conundrum. How do we get to know God? Through nature. And I won't have time to demonstrate this tree this morning. Or know Jesus Christ. Remember what Jesus said, love the Lord thy God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul. Love you, and love your neighbor as yourself. It boils down to all of that. You can't get to know God unless you love him more than anything else, or the light. Jesus said, if you believe in God, believe also in me. You cannot separate the man from the Christ. When Jesus sacrificed himself on the cross, the ground shook. The veil of the temple was rent in twain from top to bottom, and the dead walked among the living. He so personified love that the stars of heaven were moved. No other master has done that. No other master lived a perfect life. And in that moment when he died and sacrificed himself, he took responsibility for all 7.2 billion of us, whether we believe in him or not, because it's not in him we need to believe in, it's love. And since he became the perfect example of love, my suggestion is we get to know him. And whether you start through a bonsai tree, a rock, a saint, or the Bible, or Buddha, you will always end up going through him.